More LRMs cracked off against the giant trees. It was a serious barrage. A storm of dead needles fell on his Blackhawk like dried rain, dislodged from branches mounting 100 meters into the sky. Jorgensen's battle computer had tagged the distant shooter as a catapult. The 65-ton battlemech was slow for this lightning raid. Doubtless the Lyrans intended it to hang on the edge of the spaceport, giving long-range support from its big missile racks and light but far-reaching autocannon, while the faster machines raced around, releasing hell and havoc. Often an afterthought in discussions of inner-sphere close fire support battlemechs, the 65-ton catapult tenaciously clings to the hearts of many mech warriors, not just for its iconic classic look, but also for its long history and connection to the Capellans and Draconis Combine. Of course, it didn't get there overnight, and the story of the catapult's rise to become one of the staple battlemechs of BattleTech Succession Wars fights is an exciting mixture of corporate opportunity and the ever-present advantage that generalists have in an environment under pressure. Let's see what all this nonsense is about. First stomping off the assembly lines of Hollis Incorporated in 2561, the catapult was introduced well into the golden age of battlemech construction. For Hollis, however, the CPLT-C1 catapult was their first attempt at creating a mech, and considerable effort was put into the design to make sure it was hardy and useful. An entirely new production line was set up in order to meet expected demand for this new close fire support battlemech. Having quickly secured an initial production run contract with the Terran hegemony, Hollis got to work and the lines quickly began to show results with a surprising number of catapults produced in those first few years. Constructed around a Magma 260 fusion engine wrapped in an in-house produced Hollis Mark II structure, this provided the strength and power necessary for the catapult to meet the needs of most clients, which would want a battlemech that could keep up with its peers while also being strong and steady enough for a long service life. The 64 km/h top speed matched most heavy mechs at the time, but what really helped the Catapult C1 shine as a mobile firing platform was the addition of 4 Anderson Model 21 jump jets, which allowed the mech to leap up to 120 meters. This added a significant agility to a battlemech which thrived upon positioning and being able to quickly move to where it was needed in a constantly shifting battlefield environment. Deciding to go without lower arm and hand actuators has proven to be a controversial choice. Since opportunity cost spares no one, it ended up being a trade between the convenience of a streamlined mech design without worry about any arm maintenance and the inherent risk of a mech that would have a much harder time standing after a fall. Clearly, Hollis figured the juice was worth the squeeze. The catapult's 10 tons of Duralex heavy plate armor provided considerable protection for a mech generally considered a fire support design. For comparison, the JM6S Jaeger mech was protected by only 6 tons of armor, and the 60-ton Quickdraw 4G had only 8. This unexpected protection really underlined the fact that Hollis expected the catapult to be in the fray, so to speak, rather than skulking in the distance and offering token fire support with the LRMs. The catapult was going to get dirty, and it was well equipped to do so. Without a doubt, the primary weapons for the Catapult C1 were the paired Holly LRM-15 racks built into the mech's shoulders. The damage potential from these twin launchers was considerable, though critics of the C1 were quick to point out that fed by just 1 ton of ammunition apiece left the mech with just 8 shots per launcher. Fans of the design pointed out that this was just motivation for the Catapult's Mechwarrior to maximize its agility and make those shots count. Thankfully, the C1 was also blessed with a quartet of classic and reliable Martel medium lasers, which added a significant short and medium range boost to the mech's offensive power. Once again, this reinforced the mission statement of creating a close fire support mech that could give as well as it gets. Thankfully, the 15 single heat sinks included in the C1's build allowed for a mix of viable tactics and movement and firing of its weapons. Leaping its full distance while firing both LRM launchers left the mech at -1 heat, and in the middle of the fray, firing all 4 medium lasers while on the run was also not enough to leave the mech with heat issues. The final result was a battle mech which could fight in a variety of ways and situations and be quite valuable. In the interest of full disclosure, I do have to mention that one of the only complaints from the first production runs of the Catapult involved the Anderson 21 jump jets. Apparently, reports began to filter back to Hollis with descriptions of the conductive housings for the jump jets beginning to corrode under heavy use. This led to jump jet exhaust escaping into the internals of the mech, which could cause additional damage and heat issues. I wasn't able to track down any information on what Hollis did in response to it, but narratively, one could be a little wary of those older C1s if you go too heavy on the jumping. Now, fans of the channel know that I love my generalist battle mechs. Those who dismiss the Catapult C1 as a fire support mech do it a disservice. It has the hops, decent firepower, and isn't prone to massive overheating issues like so many other 3025 era battle mechs. Now, what's not to like about that?
A wave of long-range missiles fired by Verheiden's Catapult in Nordhoff 6 o'clock hit 2 floors below the infantry. The missiles channeled deep into the old building and exploded. The blast shook the entire warehouse. Then, slowly at first, the building's support structure gave way. It collapsed, the upper floors plunging straight down into the lower floors. In a few heartbeats, the entire building collapsed. A cloud of gray-brown concrete dust rose up like a tombstone. There was no way the infantry squad could have escaped.
Unfortunately, the promising early years of the Catapult would not continue. The limited contract for production with the Terra Hegemony was not renewed in 2563, and Hollis Incorporated suddenly found itself in a situation where they were producing a prolific number of battle mechs without a ready buyer. It's important to note here that while the Terra Hegemony did not want to continue the agreement, it wasn't due to any inherent flaw or deficiency in the Catapult. Naturally, with mechs to sell, representatives from Hollis were quick to act. Defying laws meant to limit the procurement of military technology to the great houses, Hollis started selling small numbers of catapults to the houses just to keep the company afloat right up until the end of the Reunification War. Production was slowly ramped down over time, and eventually the Catapult line was retooled for the new Battlemaster assault mech. It wasn't until representatives from the Draconis Combine contacted the company asking about the Catapult did Hollis revisit their battle mech. This would eventually generate the connections necessary for the Catapult K2 project, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. The earliest recorded official variant for the Catapult was designated the A1 in 2563, just a few years after the original. And much like a steak sauce you're now thinking about, this variant really shouldn't be needed if you cook the proverbial steak right. Now I'm hungry. Dang it. What was I talking about? Oh yeah. The Catapult A1 was a refit which pulled all 4 of the medium lasers in favor of doubling the LRM launcher ammunition stock and adding 2 tons of additional armor, bringing the total to 12. While the intent was clearly to improve the mech's ability to continue firing those LRM-15s for longer, it came at the terrifying cost of leaving the mech defenseless should an enemy close within the minimum range of the LRMs. While the A1 does meet its goals of boosting the LRMs, the cost was too much for many to bear. Another early variant for the Catapult was the C4, which debuted in 2565 shortly after Hollis's first production run of the C1. It upgraded the LRM-15s to 20s at the cost of downgrading the 4 medium lasers to a pair of small lasers and the removal of 5 of the heat sinks. While this did vastly improve the long-range damage potential, much like the A1 variant, the price was paid in a more vulnerable battle mech. By the collapse of the Star League, many of the remaining catapults in existence were packed safely into cradles and left the inner sphere along with General Kerensky in the Exodus. While the battle mech's performance in the field had been positive over the decades, including service in both sides of the American Civil War, it didn't catch on like so many other classic battle mechs. Of those remaining within the inner sphere, many were found within the militaries of the Draconis Combine and the Capellan Confederation. The Combine established a particular liking for the mech, and the presence of the Hollis production line on Cori within the Capellan Confederation made a friend out of proximity for the Capellans. It's Cori that's the setting for one of my favorite Catapult anecdotes. When the Free Worlds League made advances into Capellan territory in July of 2787 during the First Succession War, they initially saw little in the way of substantive defense. In the Cori system, the 19th and 20th American militias saw little opposition even as they landed and cleared their LZ. What they didn't know was that the 10th Confederation Reserve Cavalry, which consisted of former SLDF soldiers, had created a trap with the help of a short battalion of catapults pulled from the on-hand stock of the Hollis factory, planetside. Concealed in and around the buildings of the spaceport within the capital city of Valasha, the Capellans waited until the time was right before unleashing waves of LRM fire into the unprepared Merrick forces. Instead of staying to fight it out, the Capellans quickly fell back into the city, seeking to draw in the invaders for a street-by-street slugfest. To the credit of the Merrick commanders, they didn't take the bait. When overflights were ordered to gather intelligence, they too came under LRM fire from the defenders with their catapults. Unfortunately for the Capellans, this was the first succession war, and well-dug-in ground forces were nothing in comparison to orbital fire from warships. Deemed too troublesome to root out through conventional means, the Free Worlds League commanders called down fire onto Valasha, rendering much of the city into burning rubble. Though being incinerated is not an ideal outcome for the catapults or Hollis, it wasn't due to any shortcoming from the mech or manufacturer. In 2934, in yet another Free Worlds League assault on the Capellan Confederation, Merrick forces sought to claim the freshwater storage from a planet named Hessian. Among the planet's defenders were catapults assigned to the Capellan 15th Drakon. Through savvy use of the BattleMech's jump jets and long-range missiles, Lieutenant Martin Davis led his command lance to great effect against the Merrick invaders. Though the outcome of the fight was not recorded, it's a nice example of the catapult pulling its weight in a fight. We do know that Davis's catapult was passed on to his son Conan, so that implies that at least the mech survived the run-in on Hessian. Hopping down the timeline a bit to 3027, the catapult clings to relevance even though the succession wars wore down the meager supply. Still, those that still plotted around the battlefields of the Inner Sphere made their presence known. In the case of Mechwarrior Jenny Templeton and her catapult, both would find a measure of fame during the Fourth Succession War. Templeton's special refit, now referenced as the Butterbee, earned a nasty reputation as a brawling urban fighter due to its unique loadout. Counting on her enemies to make the assumption that her catapult would be limited in close quarters combat, Templeton would lure in her prey with shots from her medium lasers. Once at the optimum distance, when it was too late to escape, the Mechwarrior triggered her 4 SRM-6s in a wall of short-range missile mayhem. The potential 48 damage in conjunction with the medium lasers obliterated many foes before they could even process what was coming. One might notice that the armor distribution on the Butterbee is slightly different than on the stock catapult, but it's only a few points here and there, and the total armor hasn't changed from the original 10 tons. Overall, if you're a fan of close-range jumpy brawling, the Butterbee is a fantastic choice if you want to surprise someone who thinks you're just running a C1 or C3 variant.
I've got it. I planted the mech's right foot, digging the clawed toes into the ground and pivoted. As I brought Ghost around, the catapult resolved itself on my holo display. It looked like my Mad Cat 3, save it lacked arms. The forward thrust cockpit did have 2 underslung autocannons, and they fired. A second later, the shoulder-mounted LRM launchers blossomed fire and smoke. While the catapult was merely a figment of the range control computer, it was able to project data into my mech, and did so with a vengeance. A glance at my secondary monitor showed armor evaporating over Ghost's chest and right leg, expanding a hole opened by an earlier tangle with a panther. The autocannon slugs pounded my right arm, and one of my small lasers winked out of existence.
As previously mentioned, the Draconis Combine took a particular shine to the catapult, and by the early 3030s they were eager to upgrade the remaining stock and produced a new variant. The final product reflects a very Kurita design philosophy and creates a whole new line of catapults that generated their own devoted fanbase among mech warriors. The designers of the Catapult K2 took a big risk by removing the iconic LRM launchers from the mech in favor of a pair of particle projection cannons. It also carried an 11th ton of armor, slightly improving its durability. Swapping scattered damage for 2 powerful shots at long distance made the K2 a more potent mech hunter from the pure damage perspective. Unfortunately, in order to make the build viable with the addition of 5 more heat sinks, 2 of the medium lasers had to be replaced with a pair of machine guns, and in an act that makes me a very sad frog, all 4 of the jump jets were also sacrificed to the PPC gods. The end result is a clearly more powerful battlemech, but one that comes at a significant cost for those who enjoy the agility of the previous catapults. Overall, the K2 is a solid machine that suffers slightly from the limitation of single heatsinks. Now that's about as critical as I'm going to get for the K2, because the last thing I need right now is the very vocal K2 fanbase after me. I'll wake up one morning with a Balius cockpit in my bed. As it turned out, the K2 Catapult was a hit among the Combine mech warriors, so when the Helm memory core upgrades started to show up in battlefields across the Inner Sphere, it's not surprising that the K2 received an upgrade as well. In 3047, the Catapult K3 hit the scene with an entirely unsurprising replacement of the PPCs with the extended range variety. This of course pushed up the heat generation for the mech significantly. Thankfully, the K3 also received double heat sinks, 20 of them to be specific. Just looking at the record sheet, it's difficult to get a critical hit on this thing without hitting a double heatsink. They are everywhere. With the ability to sink 40 heat per turn, the K3 could fire both ERPPCs and both medium lasers while on the run without crossing over into the red. 2 heat-neutral ERPPC shots every turn from a 65-ton battle mech? That's pretty nice, even without the jump jets. But I digress. The K3 is technically a little oversynced, but in the pantheon of complaints about battle mechs, that's a pretty minor one. The sight of the enemy K3 stalking its prey had to make a few mech warriors feel pretty vulnerable. For those who prefer a more missile-based catapult experience, there was an option in 3049 with the production of the C3 variant. The Capellans, who fielded the vast majority of existing catapults, were eager to incorporate new technologies into their beloved battle mech. In a somewhat controversial move, the C3 also removed the 2 LRM racks in favor of a single Aero 4 launcher installed into the right arm and right torso. Fed with just 1 ton of ammunition, this gave the C3 variant just 5 opportunities to completely wreck a target with those Aero 4 missiles. Thankfully, the jump jets are there to help facilitate those shots, and the 4 medium lasers scattered across the torsos provided at least some protection once the ammo bin inevitably runs dry. Your judgment of the C3 is likely going to boil down to how you feel about putting all your eggs in one basket with those 5 Aero 4 shots. Yes, they could absolutely be game changers, but if you consistently miss, you have a 65-ton battle mech with less weaponry than a 35-ton Jenner. The Capellan catapults that received the upgrade to the C3 variant were often paired up with Ravens that could act as spotters with their target acquisition gear. Some reports exist describing lances that consist of 3 C3 catapults aided by a single Raven to intensify the missile artillery barrages. The prospect of being on the receiving end of this is just vaguely horrifying. Instead of clan mechs, the Nashur Home Guard cadets face designs common to the Capellan Confederation. Each enemy machine bearing the Confederation's infamous gauntlet and sword insignia, a testament to recent tensions mounting along the compact's border. The Jägermech and one of the new Snake designs were shielding an enemy catapult armed with Aero 4 homing missiles, while a light Raven scout mech tried to sneak in from the east flank to tag one of the compact battle mechs with a spotting laser. Post-clan invasion, the Catapult C-line would see another upgrade which fits more with the traditional weapons set. The C4C Catapult was introduced in 3055 and it featured twin LRM-20s in the traditional arm mounts, though due to the installation of an XL engine, they would be fed by 2 tons of ammunition apiece along with the other gear. The 464 movement was retained and the 10 heatsinks converted over to the double variety. Not all in service to those LRM-20s, a standard large laser was installed into the right torso. Now you might be thinking, Mechfrog, that's great and all, but this mech is missing something, and I'd agree. That's why the C4C also carries a Beagle active probe in the left torso along with an emotional support small pulse laser in the center torso. The C4C ended up being a logical, if slightly more vulnerable battle mech that could dish out a significant boost in damage over the original C1. That XL engine added an additional cost and was likely the key component for deciding if one prefers the C4C over other options. Personally, I see this hunter-killer catapult as an interesting option, but one I'd likely not take into battle unless options were limited. Now before we move on, I do want to take a moment to point out the catapult did play an important role in the Battle of Tukiad between the clans and Comstar's Comguard. Both the C1 and C3 variants were represented within the heavy mech assets deployed by the Comguard, They provided crucial close fire support in those hit-and-run tactics which frustrated the clans to the point of exhaustion. Good for you, Catapult. Now eat clan large pulse laser freebirth scum. Before we leap forward in the timeline, keep in mind there are several 3050 and 3060s decade refits and variants that tweak the core builds that we've covered so far. If you're interested in looking into them, I would recommend heading over to Flex Sheets to see what they're all about. I'll include the link to that website in the video notes. It's great for digital record keeping during your BattleTech games, and they're printable as well if you're old like me and prefer to hold paper. Our next stop on the rather extensive list of official variants is the Catapult C2. While the C1 and C3 arrived much earlier in the timeline, the C2 didn't arrive until 3062. It took advantage of an XL engine upgrade along with Endosteel in order to maintain that 464 movement, while also upgrading the C-line weaponry. The two original LRM-15s were upgraded with Artemis 4 fire control systems and each fed with 2 tons of ammunition. The traditional medium lasers were removed in favor of 2 LB-2X autocannons split between the left and right torso. Both of the LB-2Xs were fed by a single ton of ammunition in their right torso. The C2 also had 10 double heat sinks, which made the mech impossible to overheat unless you're standing in a volcano while eating Carolina Reaper chips and doing cardio. The 11.5 tons of standard armor provided a decent boost to protection to partially offset the risk of that XL engine. I see the Catapult C2 as a powerful crit-seeking support mech rather than the mid-range fighter it once was. With the more vulnerable XL engine and the considerable amount of unprotected ammunition in the side torsos, most would be wise to avoid marching the C2 into the fray. With no energy weapons, the C2 was also locked to supply lines, which limited its effectiveness on longer campaigns. So, word for the wary. If you're looking for a wildcard variant that could really throw a wrench into an enemy's formation, the Catapult H2 is an interesting variant that arrived on the scene in 3064. Unlike most of the previous variants, there is no twin weapons setup with LRMs or PPCs. Instead, a single PPC dominates the left arm, while 8 rocket launcher 20s were spread across the mech's torsos and arms. For those uninitiated, the rocket launchers are single-shot weapons with a +1 penalty to hit, but when they do hit, boy, they can cause a lot of damage. With 2 additional medium lasers in the center torso, the H2 had a very high one-shot damage potential, followed up by a somewhat lackluster energy build configuration. The 13 double heat sinks were adequate for moderate use of the rocket launchers, though if you do go all in and fire 8 at once, you're looking for a warm following turn. It's a fairly well protected mech with 11 tons of standard armor, so you stand pretty good odds of surviving long enough to fire at least some of those rockets. If you're really into rocket launchers or just want to give the weapon a first try, the H2 is a good pick for that. Taking another hop down the timeline to 3068, the Catapult K4 added an interesting new twist to the K-line variants. It swapped out the 2 ER PPCs from earlier versions and replaced them with a pair of heavy PPCs, which could match the damage potential of the clan version of their ER PPC. The heavy PPCs were backed up with a pair of ER medium lasers and all aided by a C3 slave computer installed into the center torso. This upgrade was made possible with a downgrade of the engine to a 195 standard fusion, which dropped the K4's movement profile to just 353 with 3 jump jets. It also had a conversion of the armor to 12.5 tons of light ferrofibrous. This significantly slower catapult could hit hard consistently thanks to the installation of 17 double heat sinks, which fill every nook and cranny of this battle mech's internal space. In fact, there isn't a single open location left on the K4 for even an emotional support small laser. What a shame. Being able to consistently fire both heavy PPCs was an obvious plus, and the abundance of light ferrofibrous armor made the mech a tough nut to crack. But, as we know well by now, opportunity cost spares no one. That speed reduction is painful in an era where even a 464 is considered slow. Dropping down to a 353 is downright glacial. Now, for no reason at all, our next official variant we're going to cover is the Catapult C6, which was first spotted in 3069. It benefits from a swap over to Endosteel and buys some mass for use elsewhere with it. Including 12.5 tons of standard armor, it makes the mech a little tougher for its role as a medium and short-range brawler. In a bold and brave move, 2 plasma rifles were added to the Catapult's right arm along with 6 tons of ammunition. 2 ER medium lasers were added to the center torso, and the whole rig was kept cool with 15 double heat sinks. Now, fans of the channel know I have an affinity for plasma-based weaponry, so I'm inclined to appreciate the effort with the C6. Still, it's a bit odd as placing both plasma rifles in the right arm creates a lopsided build without a clear purpose. It also inexplicably has a case installed in the left torso, even though the mech has no ammunition that can explode. It's a largely heat-efficient build, only ending up at +2 if firing an alpha strike while on the run, +4 if it leaps the full 120 meters. The C6 is a neat, if deliberately imperfect design. We may have to do a little bit better later on. One of the catapults loosed both LRM-15 pods in a ripple-fire volley from a range of 90 meters, and suddenly the air was filled with writhing, lancing contrails and the crack and thump of detonating warheads. One explosion cracked sharply alongside her head. A second and a third rocket struck her right arm close to the muzzle of her missile launcher. Still another LRM flashed in through the smoke, striking the damaged spot in her armor with a sharp, ringing bang that staggered Lori, knocking her Zeus back a step. 4 more missiles followed the first into the same general area, a savage, deadly clustering of explosions low in her side that peeled back a meter-wide section of plate armor and exposed a tangle of wiring and power conduits inside. Our last official variant is also the most recent in our timeline. In a bizarre twist of fate, the Catapult K6 abandoned the long chain of energy weapons and returned to a classic 2 LRM launcher style with a pair of extended LRM-15s. Able to reach out to an incredible 38 hexes, the K6 could rain down fire well beyond almost all other weapons on the battlefield. What is sometimes overlooked is the advantage that the extended LRM racks have at closer ranges. When between 10 and 12 hexes is short range and up to 22 hexes is medium range, that's an advantage to your 2-hit rolls that the opponent may not have. Sure, the 10 hex minimum range does force the ELRM user to keep their distance, but credit where it is due. In the case of the K6, the ELRM launchers are aided by actuator enhancement systems, which further improve the launcher's accuracy with a -1 on their 2-hit rolls. For close-range conflict resolution, 4 ER small lasers were split between the left and right torsos, as to not leave the mech entirely defenseless should the proverbial cow chips hit the fan. The 10 double heat sinks are plenty, and the 12.5 tons of light ferrofibrous armor make the mech a tough nut to crack. Unfortunately, the downgraded XL engine left the K6 with a dreaded 353 movement profile, and there is no case installed to protect the vulnerable engine slots from the 4 tons of ELRM ammunition stored in the arms and right torso. As of the latest intel, the Catapult K6 is being produced by Yori Mechworks on El Getty, so it's very likely they'll be spotted among the forces of the Draconis Combine as we all march further into the IlClan era. With the Capellans still producing earlier variants and having an unending love of the Catapult, it's very likely they'll get their grubby hands on the K6 as well. The defending line of Davion mechs, 2 Valkyries, 2 Griffins, and 2 Catapults, under heavy fire from the Tenchis, kept the enemy away from the partially collapsed mech bay long enough for the trapped Battlemaster to finally push free from the rubble. The defending mechs alternate moving in and out of cover, relying on targeting data from the gunsmiths to maintain a constant stream of missiles while denying the Tenchi a target as its Mechwarrior tries to focus its 5 light PPCs at them. Now I was eager to take a crack at creating my own totally unofficial and non-canon catapult, and I think I came up with something that'll please most of the channel regulars. The Catapult MF retains the traditional 464 movement with the use of a light fusion engine, and fits the theme of the original K-series variants with a swap away from the LRMs to embrace energy weapons. However, in our case, we're going to go with 2 plasma rifles split between the arms. Each is fed with 2 tons of ammunition. That ammunition is stored in the left and right torsos next to the engine critical locations to offer some opportunity for critical hits to strike the inert ammunition rather than the engine. The 12 tons of standard plate provides solid protection for what is envisioned as a short and medium range brawler. The accuracy of the plasma rifles is improved with the installation of a targeting computer in the right torso. Finally, a pair of SRM-4s were split between the right and left torso to add a short-range insult upon injury for targets that should already be on fire from plasma impacts. 2 tons of SRM ammunition were placed into the right torso along with Case 2. For your convenience, I made sure that one of those tons was Inferno rounds on the record sheet available in the video notes below. With 13 double heat sinks, the mech is heat neutral at a standstill while alpha striking and only +2 on the run. The mech's limitations include the more vulnerable engine and total reliance upon ammunition. However, the combined 50 shots of SRMs should be plenty for even extended battles. If you're into brawling catapults or like setting things on fire, I'd recommend giving the Catapult MF a try. So why do we love the Catapult? Oh, for so many reasons. From its unique fluff in the lore, under-the-table deals with house clients, to those amazing legs in the original Ral Partha pewter sculpts. It's a generalist battle mech that people assume is a fire support design, and I think that works to its advantage. For people who can ID and use it effectively, the Catapult can be a force multiplier that carries its weight easily. The forking design philosophies between K and C variants offer plenty of opportunity for playstyles and preferences, and there seems to be a variant out there for everyone. The Catapult has earned its place in the game of Armored Combat Box, and in our hearts. Do you have a Catapult story that needs to be told? Is there a variant that I missed that deserves some limelight? Where are all these limes coming from that are giving off so much light? Let me know in the comments and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you as always for coming by as we talked BattleTech. A special thank you to Big Red 40 Tech and Road Beer for offering up their voices for this video. If you enjoy this content and feel it's worthy, don't forget the thumbs up button and even hitting subscribe so it'll make it much more likely you'll see my nonsense in the future. For those who have already taken the extra step and become channel members or supported on Ko-fi, thank you very much. Without you, none of this would be possible. Until we meet again, please take care of yourself and your loved ones by making this world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.